This UCSD TV program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest programs.
Welcome to the UC San Diego's Osher Lifelong Learning Institute Distinguished Lecture Series. Today we have Professor David Lake. Professor Lake is presently the Jerry Ann and Gary E. Jacobs Professor of Social Sciences and the Distinguished Professor in the Department of Political Sciences at UCSD. He received his PhD at Cornell University and has written some 14 books and over 100 articles on international relations. Ladies and gentlemen, the UCSD San Diego's Chancellor Associates 2013 Faculty Excellence Award recipient in Research in Humanities and Social Sciences, Professor David Lake.
Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here. Have this opportunity to speak with you about some current research that I'm engaged in on state building. And particularly why it's such a difficult problem. Social planners often refer to problems as wicked problems, by which they mean that there's no easy solution. Right? They're wicked not in any normative sense, and I want to try and avoid much of that in our discussions today. But they're difficult to solve. At the core of our current state building problem is what I call the state builder's dilemma. And it is this dilemma that makes the problem of state building so difficult. And the dilemma is the following. States that are sufficiently motivated to spend the blood and treasure and time that's involved in building a state in some foreign land will typically have some sort of political interest within that country. We don't do state building capriciously. We don't go overseas to countries in which we don't have interests. We are mostly concerned about state building in those countries in which the United States has some deep national or economic interest that's motivating its behavior. And when we go overseas to engage in state building, we tend to promote leaders who are sympathetic to our interests. We want to sort of build within the state some leader who's going to be able to enact policies that are consistent with our interests in that country. But when we promote these, what I will call loyal leaders, we undermine the legitimacy that they may acquire in their own home societies. This in turn undermines the state building process, produces undemocratic leaders who are not supported by their own populations, and thus we fail to build consolidated and effective states in those very countries to which we're purported to be engaging in state building. This is not a policy of malicious intent. It's not a policy of incompetence. It follows, in fact, from trying to balance two competing but equally compelling goals. We want to build states that are legitimate in the eyes of their own people, but states that are led by leaders who will be sympathetic to our interests. Nonetheless, the outcome of this contradiction is a self-defeating policy on the United States and states that are doomed to fail yet again. Right? So this is the core of the problem. Let me step back and talk a little bit about why we care about state building to begin with. Right? And the core of the state building problem is that what we call ungoverned spaces are dangerous. They're threatening. Failed states are one example of ungoverned space. We rely upon governments to pursue law, to enact law, to provide security for people who live within their territories. This is what states do. Failed states are those that are unable to provide these basic securities and other services. They are basically ungoverned. Right? But they become sites. The reason we care about them is it becomes sites from which private groups may attack other states. They are sort of the home bases, if you will, for terrorist groups. Transborder insurgents, drug smuggling, host of other social ills at the international level are often find hospitable homes in these ungoverned areas. And in turn, other states, in trying to regulate and deter terrorism, drug smuggling, and so on, intervene into these ungoverned spaces. They intervene into these failed states, which in turn carry in some risk of war and opposition from other neighboring countries who fear that they may become a future target of these same similar kinds of interventions. So they create political difficulties at the very least. And at most, these ungoverned spaces create this sort of vicious stew of violence, as suggested by the recent attacks in Kenya, which sort of occupied many of us in the news for the last couple of weeks. But this is a perfect example of the kinds of ills that arise within these ungoverned spaces and failed states. Somalia has been, since about 1989, sort of the exemplar, if you will, of a failed state. Has gone now almost 3 decades without an effective functioning government within the territory that we recognize as the sovereign state of Somalia. Al-Shabaab, which is an Islamist group largely made up of Somalis, but not entirely, has flourished in this ungoverned space. Al-Shabaab broke off as a violent wing of what was called the Union of Islamic Courts, which is probably the closest thing that Somalia has had to a government in the last several decades. Almost succeeded in sort of trying to create a new central government. But because the Union of Islamic Courts is opposed by the United States and other regional non-Islamic states, it's been undermined, undercut, if you will, from the outside. Kenya led an African Union force in 2011 into Somalia with the express purpose of breaking up the Union of Islamic Courts government and particularly trying to break the power of Al-Shabaab, which is sort of its military wing. It was relatively successful in carrying out that operation. However, not completely successful, and as Al-Shabaab has rebuilt its strength, it threatened and then eventually carried out an attack in Kenya several weeks ago in which they attacked the shopping mall in downtown Nairobi. After the hostages were released and the operation was over, a couple days later, U.S. Special Forces attacked an Al-Shabaab base on the coast in Somalia. So if we sort of think about this sequence of events, this sort of exemplifies precisely the kinds of problems that grow out of these ungoverned spaces. Private groups acting outside the law carry out their own political agenda. They use their home ungoverned space to lash out at others, in this case Kenya. The United States intervenes to trying to repress the group and is met with opposition from other African countries who oppose American intervention. So it raises a whole series of interesting questions, right? First, who's responsible for controlling Al-Shabaab, right? The Somali government doesn't exist. They can't control their own citizens. So who's supposed to do that? Who within sort of the international system is in charge, so to speak, of regulating and trying to repress social violence from such groups? In turn, if a country like the United States takes on the responsibility, it's actually engaging in what is technically a violation of international law and engaging in acts that would be considered acts of war against Somalia. The only reason we can get away with it is that there's no Somali government to complain, right? There's no opposition, if you will, other than from other weak states who are opposed to similar kinds of intervention more generally. So it provides this very thorny problem of what do we do with these ungoverned spaces and the groups who take up residence within them and use them as platforms to disturb international order and security. The proximate solution now for decades has been to try and go in and build effective states in these ungoverned spaces, right? The first option, the best choice as it's regarded, is to go in and build a state. And then the Somali government will be rehabilitated, it will control its territory, and manage al-Shabaab or its successors on into the future. And this is why we worry about state building. Let's step back one step further now, having sort of made the case sort of why we should care. Let's think a little bit about why states fail in the first place. Why don't we have effective states around the world? We want to start with an understanding of the disease, if you will, before we turn to sort of writing prescriptions on how to do this. Right? And we often fail to make this step backwards, to really ask about the roots of state failure. What I'm doing here is trying to think about two dimensions of states. Max Weber, famous German sociologist writing in the 1920s, has given us our classic definition of the state as an entity with a monopoly over the legitimate use of violence within an established territory. That's what the state is, right? Has a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. It may not be the only purveyor of violence within a society, but it's the only one that's legitimate. And what we mean by legitimate violence is that, well, hate to say it, but most of us probably break a traffic rule or two. You may slide through that stop sign, right? Not making quite the full stop. We don't always follow the law. But nonetheless, if we're caught, we recognize that the government has the right to enforce the law. They give you the ticket, and you have an obligation to pay it. You might moan and groan a little bit about having to pay that ticket, but you don't challenge the government's right to enforce the rules. Right? That's the legitimate use of violence. The violence in this case being a punitive ticket to which you feel obligated and recognize the right that you actually have to pay that traffic ticket. Right. So we can think of states that have both a monopoly on violence and have a legitimate use of violence. And we think of these as being consolidated states. These are the advanced industrialized democracies like the United States. Governments in which there is largely a unified force, coercive force within the society, as well as legitimacy, that we accept the uses of those force by society. Failed states exist down here at the other end of this sort of continuum, in which there are multiple purveyors of violence, multiple actors within society who use force against one another in their relations, and in turn, the state is not necessarily legitimate. Here, the law has evaporated, disappeared. No one regards the government as anything other than perhaps just another militarized faction within society. Right? But there are intermediate states who run a risk of failure. Consolidated states rarely, if ever, as we define them and measure them in political science, rarely, if ever, fail. Okay? It just doesn't happen very often. But the intermediate categories will often fall into what we would consider at least be a fragile state or failed state. We have a category we call predatory states. What we have in mind here are states that retain their monopoly over the use of violence and are typically regarded as legitimate by only a relatively small fraction of the society. Think here of an autocratic government which has built a support coalition perhaps amongst the political and economic elite within its country, but the vast majority of citizens in that society would not regard their government as being appropriate or legitimate in the full sense of that word. When the monopoly on violence begins to crack, then the state very quickly fails. Think here of examples of almost any of the governments in the recent Arab Spring period, especially Libya and Syria. Governments that were fragile for a very long period of time, autocratic rule. Once either the military began to separate from one from the other, or groups mobilized and took up arms themselves against their own government, the state very quickly unraveled and failed in that way. The other category we have are factionalized states. And what we mean here are states that may be legitimate, they may be accepted by their societies, but there are very strong traditional social forces that parallel and exist alongside the government, that exert a measure of authority. Think here, just to fix the idea in your mind, clans within Afghanistan. Right? Very strong traditional social groupings that are hierarchically organized within themselves, often use force in blood feuds against other clans for very long periods of time, that are not in some sense subordinate to the government. Government may declare the use of clan violence illegal, but nobody regards it as a realistic constraint on behavior. Right? So these clans can often parallel the government for very long periods of time. in a sort of unsteady equilibrium between legitimate authority by the government and these traditional social structures. When private groups enter into conflict with one another, and the state cannot suppress that conflict, or when the government itself becomes a partisan to violence within those societies, when it sort of takes one side over that of the other, these factionalized states can also fall into violence very quickly and in turn unravel. You sort of get a spiral effect here where one group turns inward upon itself to protect its members from violence from another group. They begin to arm. The process of self-arming poses a threat to the other group, which in turn takes up arms to protect itself, and the hostility grows out of control. Very quickly, the state unravels. So thinking about states this way in the process of state failure identifies a variety of things that any state-building effort needs to do. And sort of walking through these things, I think, at least for me, sort of captures the magnitude of the problem of what we have to do here. The essence of state building is reconstituting the monopoly of legitimate violence or the state, right? That's almost by definition. But both of those parts of it are very difficult. We know it's very difficult to reintegrate rebel forces back into the state military, right? Just imagine how difficult that process is. You've been fighting for years, perhaps, and suddenly now you're going to reintegrate the insurgents, the rebels, the terrorists, whatever you want to call them, back into the military to recreate that monopoly of violence on the part of the state. Even more difficult, I think, is establishing the legitimacy of that monopoly on violence, wherein we as all members of society or some target society would come to recognize that the government has the right to enforce rules using coercion against us. Recall, we've just now perhaps been fighting against our neighbors for years and decades, and we have to share the governmental space with them and recognize their role in that government as being appropriate and socially just. Right? Very difficult operation. So you have to marry these two things back together, the monopoly and the legitimacy of violence. You also have to overcome the distributional conflicts, whether they're class conflicts that sort of separate society horizontally, or perhaps vertical conflicts between various sectarian or ethnic or clan-based groups within society. You have to overcome the distributional conflicts that separated that society in the first place and caused it to fall into violence. What was the issue that drove them to take up arms against one another and potentially fight for years, decades, in the case of some civil wars? So you have to figure out what that issue is and figure out how to compromise on those issues that caused the state to fail in the first place. And then finally, you have to promote new leaders who can build a political support coalition. And one of the facts about these failed states is there are no George Washingtons in there, sort of national figures who everybody can unify around. Well, if that figure had existed in the first place, the state probably wouldn't have failed. Right? Moreover, in the process of failure, any individual who might have a claim to national standing is typically assassinated, right? Because they're an impediment to the pursuit of the narrower interests by the various groups within those societies. Right? So we're coming into a very difficult political process where we have to reestablish a monopoly of legitimate violence. We have to overcome these distributional conflicts, and we have no generally recognized national leaders who can lead that process. Right? Very difficult political challenges here. And then we come in with an external state builder. Now the ambition, the aim of an external state builder, whether it's the United States, the United Nations, the European Union, whoever it might be, is to try and jumpstart the process of consolidation. The object is to come in and provide a secure enough environment for society to help write a new constitution, a new rule of law that will bring all of the warring parties together. So we want to sort of come in from the outside and try and help this process along as quickly as possible. But at the same time, as I've already suggested, we come in with our own interests and our own aspirations for what that society will become. And there is an almost irresistible tension to promote leaders that are going to be loyal or sympathetic to the external state builder. And I'll explain how that pulls us away from success. Historically, I group state-building efforts into sort of 3 periods, giving them labels of state building 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0. It's sort of, they're the basic operating systems in the literal sense of that word. These are the set of rules we use, the processes we carry out in the process of state building. State building 1.0 very aptly characterizes American state building policy, roughly from the turn of the 20th century on through about 1979, maybe 1990, somewhere in that period. Okay. The exemplary case of a U.S. state building prior to the end of the Cold War was really the U.S. role in Central America and the Caribbean. Right. These were efforts where, particularly in the early decades of the 20th century, we were concerned about European intervention, reestablishing new colonies because the state failed. It was unable to meet, the Caribbean states were unable to meet their debt obligations to Europe. The United States was afraid that the Europeans would use this as an excuse to come and reestablish control over these societies. And so the United States intervened militarily 20 times between 1898 and 1930 in Central America and the Caribbean to engage in what we would now call state building. At the time it was called imperialism. Okay. Throughout all of these efforts, the United States sort of privileged its own political and economic interests over those of the local population, and the legitimacy of the ruler was really a secondary concern. Democracy was not completely irrelevant. You know, the United States would have liked to have built democratic societies in many of those Caribbean islands and Central American states, but we almost nearly always sort of promoted a local leader, a loyal leader, over a legitimate government. As Franklin Delano Roosevelt said about Trujillo, dictator in the Dominican Republic for about 3 decades, he may be an SOB, but he's our SOB, right? And that sort of captures the essence of state building 1.0, if you will. The net effect of this policy was to create high levels of anti-Americanism, anti-colonial sentiment within the countries that were within the area of operation of the United States at this time. Right? It was sort of a blowback in which we would create a disillusioned population. The political opposition would take up an anti-American banner, and if and when that opposition ever came to power in those societies, we found ourselves with an opponent, think Cuba, rather than a friendly ally. But this problem of the sort of the state builder's dilemma is more general, and I'll come back to that. Starting around the end of the Cold War, earlier in the case of Central America, the Carter administration was a decisive break with past practice. Remember giving back the Panama Canal, the promotion of human rights within Central America. This was a first attempt to sort of try and restart our relationship with countries in Latin America. It was reversed later under the Reagan administration, and particularly the war in Nicaragua during the 1980s. But clearly since 1989, 1990, somewhere around there, there's been a new emphasis in state building on building legitimate states, right? A real shift in where the needle is between loyalty and legitimacy. Sufficient, I think, to constitute a new model of state building 2.0. This new strategy has focused on 2 primary tasks, if you will. One is building new participatory political institutions. Almost all of the state building efforts from 1990 on have taken a very similar character. The first thing the state builder does is call a new constitutional convention, bring all the major stakeholders around the negotiating table, often 200-300 individuals coming to write a new constitution. And in turn, then based upon this new constitution, moving rapidly to local, then regional, then national elections for leaders. Paralleling this process has been policies of market liberalization, opening up the countries to international trade and investment in a way they were before. Implicit in this strategy, and in some sense the critique of state building 2.0, is that it's premised on a formal legal theory of legitimacy. As we begin to pay new attention to legitimacy, we have to ask ourselves and focus on the question of, well, what legitimates a government? Why are some governments accepted by their populations as being just and appropriate and others are not? What we brought to the table in the 1990s was sort of a formal legal conception of legitimacy. What I mean by this is that in a formal legal conception of legitimacy, lawful office confers legitimacy on an individual. Jokingly, and the joke is getting a little stale now, but I hope you'll appreciate it, it's the Arnold Schwarzenegger theory of legitimacy. Okay? Here we have sort of a B-grade actor, action figure, right, who, if you recall back in the recall election against Gray Davis, runs against 100 other candidates, many of whom were of rather unsavory backgrounds, others just regular folks like us who thought it would be fun to get their name on the ballot, right? So he runs against a wide slate, gets 35% plurality of the vote, but out of that lawful process, unusual, rarely used in California, but constitutionally provided for, through this lawful process, he becomes the governor. And the next day, he becomes entitled to all of the rights and authority exercised by the governor of California. So here's somebody that we may or may not particularly admire for his individual qualities, right? But he inherits, through this lawful process, all of the privileges and authority of being the governor. And this, we see this all the time when people may say, I don't necessarily respect the president, but I respect him as the commander-in-chief, right? All of these sentiments are all variants on this, I don't like the individual, but I have to respect the office, which confers legitimacy and rights on that individual. Well, this works fine in established rule of law countries, like the United States, like California. It's a pretty apt and appropriate, usable theory of legitimacy. And if we think about modern society, we often do rely on these conceptions of law to explain legitimacy. But it's a wholly inappropriate theory of legitimation in a failed state, particularly one that has fought years or perhaps decades of civil war against one another. There is no law to confer legitimacy on any individual. Right? What we mean, almost by definition of a failed state, is that the system of law that underlay it has disappeared, has failed, has gone away. Right? So what law is there that would sanction politician X or Y to suddenly inherit the authority of that office? What we relied upon in the 1990s was this notion that if we build participatory institutions, we write a new constitution, the constitution will then legitimate the elections, and those elections will then legitimate the individual. Right? But the problem arose, and we found it time and time again, is that the participatory institutions were not themselves inherently legitimate in societies without a history of democracy. We projected our theory of what would produce legitimacy in some foreign land onto a people who may never have participated in an election before, and moreover, were asked to sit around a table and write a constitution with people they were trying to kill the month before. Right? Not a formula for building trust and cooperation amongst social groups that will then allow them to design an electoral and political system with broad-based consent. Right? So throughout this time period, we brought an inappropriate conception of how to rebuild legitimate government to the table. And it didn't work. The other part of this is, well, what legitimates the role of the state builder coming into this society, right? Leading and authorizing this process of reform. Well, we relied upon a similar sort of formal legal conception. The United Nations would pass a resolution authorizing a coalition of the willing to intervene in the country to oversee a process of constitutional reform and security provision, public goods provision, and so on. Right? Embedded again here is this notion that a lawful organization, the UN, can pass on lawful rights to a state or a set of states who can then act legitimately in the society that they're charged with overseeing. But again, this is going to be rarely sufficient for people whose state is being built from the outside. Why should a Somali, someone from the Democratic Republic of Congo, think that the UN itself is empowering the United States, the European Union, whoever, to go in and rebuild their society for them? Right? Why is that legitimate? So we brought sort of the wrong intellectual apparatus to the table throughout much of the 1990s. And it blew up amazingly poorly in Iraq after 2003. Right? State Building 2.0 sort of flamed out in a almost tragic way in Iraq following the invasion in 2003. In 2007, we often focus on the surge as an increase in the number of troops going into Iraq, but actually far more fundamentally was a change to a counterinsurgency doctrine, and in turn, the intellectual apparatus underneath that counterinsurgency doctrine, which reflected at its core a very different theory of state building. Okay? If you read through the Army Marine Field Manual on counterinsurgency warfare, they actually have a very clear conception of what it means to build a state and how you go about building it. It's essentially a social contract theory of the state. A social contract theory sees legitimacy as following from the actions that governments do that are desired and effective for their people. Okay? That we attach legitimacy to those organizations that do for us that which we want them to do. We will give our support to a government that is doing important things for us. Okay? And this is embodied under the surge in the new oil spot strategy. So imagine how, or remember how this worked, if you will. The oil spot strategy is premised upon going in and providing security in a small area. Security being the good that seemed most desired by the Iraqi people at this time, but more generally. Right? So U.S. forces would go in, they would stabilize a village, and in turn, the villagers would provide information about where the insurgents were hiding. They often knew, right? Knew which family in the village was actually part of the insurgency, right? That information would then allow U.S. forces to establish more effective control over that area and perhaps spread out a little bit. We would then start providing health clinics and digging wells and other public services that were desired by the community. That in turn would lead them to provide more information and eventually, in some areas, actually flip and join the U.S. here. So the idea here is that by providing effective public services to communities, the United States and eventually the Iraqi government would earn the legitimacy and loyalty of their own people. Right? Very different way of thinking about how you legitimate a government. Democracy and free market sort of dropped way down in the list of priorities that the U.S. military was concerned about. But there's some problems that became evident by the time of withdrawal, and we certainly see them again in Afghanistan, where we're continuing to pursue state building 3.0. First, the legitimacy that the United States earns doesn't necessarily transfer to the new state that's being created. We've all seen, they're on the front pages of the newspapers, you can find hundreds of examples on the web if one goes looking. We would go into the village and we would build a new health clinic. And there'd be the photo of that opening of the health clinic with some lieutenant colonel sitting there, a row of American flags behind him, a few Iraqi dignitaries on either side, and a great big pair of scissors that are chopping a red, white, and blue ribbon. Right? What were we doing there? We were trying to demonstrate what we're doing for the society in hopes of gaining their acceptance of our role within Iraq. Right? Probably the right thing to be doing. Right? In order for us to do anything in Iraq, we had to have a measure of legitimacy for our role. But the problem is that the legitimacy that we acquired for ourselves by building a health clinic didn't necessarily transfer over to the Iraqi government, which would later have to maintain it, and typically did so poorly. Right? So how do you translate, or how do you sort of share the legitimacy that comes for the outside state builder with the new government continues to prove a challenge. The other big problem that we've discovered, of course, is that coin works, but it doesn't scale, in the sense that at the village level, coin clearly increases support for the United States, increases support for the Iraqi government. When you go in and do nice things for people, they reward you with legitimacy. The problem arises, though, when you have to move from the village level to the provincial level, or from the provincial level to the national level. That the legitimacy that's earned at the village level doesn't always move up. the groups that were previously fighting over the country now sit around the bargaining table and have to divide up the budget. Who gets money for what, where in Iraq or Afghanistan? The support you've built at the local level then dissipates at the national level. And getting the elites to sit around and work cooperatively remains a challenge. But throughout all of this, regardless of which model we're using, we're still stuck with this state builder's dilemma. And this dilemma becomes more acute as we emphasize legitimacy more and more. Right? In under 2.0 and 3.0, where we try and build legitimate states, this really becomes a force to bite. In State Building 1.0, we decided we didn't care and we'd be willing to support any leader who could establish control over his or her society. As we emphasize legitimacy, the state builder's dilemma becomes more acute. And it becomes more acute, even more acute, I might say, as the preferences of the local community and the state builder become further apart. I want to try and illustrate this. It's the best I can do. It's not a great diagram, but it's, I hope it will help communicate the intuition what I'm trying to do here and the way to think about the problem. Think of this as sort of a range of political preferences. The policies that you could adopt if you were to adopt the policies, right? Your ideal point is if you could write all the laws in the United States, what would that set of laws look like? That's your ideal point. Well, we can think of the United States as a whole as having an ideal point for what we would like Iraq, Afghanistan, pick your failed state, what we would like that country to look like, the kinds of policies that they would adopt. Right? So this is our preferred point. If we could design the ideal government in a failed state, it would look something like this. It's somewhat arbitrary. But then there's an array. You can think of, the average member of that society, of the failed state, would also have some conception of what they would like their government to look like, the kinds of policies it would adopt, and so on. That's the failed state's preferences. Well, here in a case like this, the preferences are actually pretty similar, where the US and the preferences in the failed state are not entirely dissimilar. Right? Think here, the two cases that everyone always points to where state building worked is West Germany and Japan after 1945. Okay? These are not societies that in the end turned out to be terribly dissimilar from the United States. Right? In terms of liberal, eventually capitalist democracies, there's a certain shared vision that emerges very early on there. The United States then is able to pick a state builder within those societies. Think of the role of Adenauer right after World War II in West Germany, who is able, with external support, Marshall Plan aid, US military forces, and the rest of it, is able to use those resources to put together a coalition that is pretty broad-based within Germany. Right? You can bring on board the majority of the German population at that time with relatively little effort because we're not that different. Right? In this case, state building can work. But imagine as the average person in that society becomes more and more distant in their vision of political future from that of the United States. Okay? What happens then is this group in society who are willing to support the American vision gets smaller and smaller. We, in turn, even giving them resources, providing for their security, helping them put together a political coalition, that political coalition is going to get smaller and smaller. It takes more money, in essence, to buy the support of somebody who's more opposed to your presence and to the kinds of policies you would want that society to pursue. Right? So the support coalition gets smaller and smaller. And when those preferences are very, very far apart, there's only a small little fraction, maybe some of you in the back can't even see that, where that very tiny group that is willing to acquiesce to a political regime favored by the United States. Okay? We can always buy more support in a failed state by offering more resources, right? But that too becomes very expensive. Right? The United States has to transfer more wealth from itself to the population of the failed state in order to buy their support for the new government. So we're always trading off. How much support do you want to how much effort and money are you willing to devote to the project. The upshot of this is the following, and this is why states fail when we try and support loyal leaders, particularly in societies that are far apart. The loyal leader is going to take the resources we transfer to him or her and use them to build their own political support coalition. They are going to be concerned not so much with the future of their country, but with staying in power. How are they going to consolidate their own rule, whether it's personalist rule or even their own political party? How are they going to consolidate their rule within the society? They're going to take the externally provided resources and use them to put together their own supporters, benefit their own supporters within that society. The state builder, in turn, supporting this loyal leader from that very small group that is willing to work with the United States, will acquiesce in this strategy. Will go along with the diversion of resources from the country as a whole to the supporters of the individual. Really don't have any choice, right? So by implication, what happens is loyal leaders will become non-democratic leaders, especially so as their preferences diverge from the United States. They can't win elections, so they have to stay in power some other way. And they do that by building a political coalition in an autocratic society. We saw this in U.S. Central American relations for almost a century, right? And we're seeing it now throughout areas where we're state building. The best examples are, in fact, in Iraq and Afghanistan. The U.S. has funneled tremendous resources into propping up both the governments of Maliki and Karzai in Iraq and Afghanistan, respectively. They've both engaged in blatant favoritism towards particular groups within their own societies. The Shiite majority in the case of Iraq, family and clan in the case of Karzai and Afghanistan. They have both run blatantly fraudulent elections, which they stole the ballot box in order to stay in power. And throughout all this time, we've really had no choice but to continue to support them, despite the fact that they're running the truck off the road, so to speak. The Bush administration repeatedly considered dropping its support for Maliki during the Iraq War, and at the end stuck with him because, quote, they had no plan B. Right? There was no one else who could take his place. Right? And so the net result is we've built states there that remain weak, unconsolidated, governed illegitimately, without the support of the bulk of their population. Empirical research that I and some of my graduate students have done show that states, as a result of this process, are no more effective than other failed states. All of our state building efforts do not promote the health and welfare of individuals within that society, and that these states are more likely to fall again, to fail in the future once we've left. So at the very least, we have no influence over the effectiveness of state building. At worst, we probably have a negative effect, that they're less effective and live shorter lives in terms of the length of the regime. So what should be done? Well, we're sort of caught on the horns of another real dilemma here, right? Sometimes the international community is going to have to act when suffering is very acute, or the risks of not acting are very high. Right? Ungoverned spaces are dangerous. Right? And sometimes the level of human suffering and atrocity is so high that self-respecting human beings cannot allow it to happen. And indeed, the problems of state failure today is probably the single largest cause of human suffering and casualties on the planet. Right? So this remains an acute problem, one that the United States and other countries will eventually have to figure out what to do. Right? But when compelled to act, we still can't solve the state builder's dilemma. We still can't figure out how to build legitimate states without also wanting to build states that will at least be sympathetic to our objectives in the region. Perhaps recognizing the dilemma, and this is the hope of writing this book that I'm engaged in, if we recognize the dilemma, we can perhaps moderate our support for loyal leaders and shift the focus even more so on building legitimate leaders over the long run. But ultimately, action will have to be pursued by countries that are somewhat more neutral, have less interest in what goes on in the failed state. But these states will, of course, be ephemeral. Think of the United States going into Somalia, the one case where we probably didn't have very deep-seated interest in 1991 when the Bush administration went into Somalia. We lasted about 9 months, and after 18 casualties, we withdrew our forces. Right? We didn't stay. We had no staying power because in the end we didn't really care what happened. Right? So we can sort of try and encourage countries with less acute interest to step up and take a greater leadership role, but they too are not going to be deeply attached and committed to staying for the long run to make these societies a success. So we have a real problem here. And we can see it, I think, if we ask, what about Syria? What are we going to do about Syria? Okay. I prepared this slide because I knew you would ask. Okay. And so we'll just start the conversation. I know there will be more. As I see it, there's really 4 options. One is somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but not entirely. I call the Egyptian option, which really isn't an option for the United States, and let me explain. Right? But what I mean by the Egyptian option is that if we look at what we've done in Egypt over the last 40 years, what we have done is cultivate an ally inside the government, the Egyptian military. Large-scale military exchanges, high levels of military aid, lots of joint practice and training, building a relationship with the Egyptian military over time, so that they are, in fact, sort of the pro-American group within the Egyptian government, and have been for quite some time now. In pursuing the state builder's dilemma, what we've done here is we've supported a loyal ally within the government more generally. Right? We've promoted the special role of the military. If we turn and think about Syria, there are no real possible allies. There are no groups that have a realistic chance of victory within Syria who are clearly committed to a Western system of democracy and free markets. Right? So we don't have the raw materials of an ally there to build on. Okay? There are some groups, there's 200 some odd militia groups within Syria. Some of them are pro-American, but they come and go like the wind. One we support today may not be there next month. Right? So we don't have the readily identifiable ally in Syria that we could cultivate in the short run and turn them into the loyal leader that we would want them to be. There's the Iraqi option, essentially what we did in Iraq after 2003, where we fight a major war in order to implant a pro-Western regime. The costs of that one are pretty obvious, and I doubt very many of us have the stomach for doing that again. There's the Libyan option, which is perhaps even worse, which was a limited military strike, largely by European and US Air Forces, that helped topple the regime in the face of a large-scale insurgency, but which then had no real state-building process attached to it, and as it becomes ever more clear by the day, becomes essentially chaos within the society. Somewhat almost our nightmare scenario. In the case of Libya here, we have created an ungoverned space that will haunt us on into the future. So the only real option is, in fact, the one that we've been pursuing without ever really saying so, which we might think of as good enough government. Right? Not good government, good enough government. Bashir al-Assad is a horrible dictator. There's no doubt about that. He's gassed his own people several times, as we now know. He's allied with Iran, clearly anti-American, he poses a threat to Israel, but he may be better than all the alternatives. Okay? And this is where we sort of find ourselves now. here in the US, with the choice between essentially creating another ungoverned space or a space that continues to be governed by somebody we find odious. Right? And which of those two alternatives is the least bad is the question before us on the table. So we're not left in a position where there's any good outcome that we could choose. We're choosing between two terrible results. And it's a question of which one you find less offensive, okay, or slightly more palatable. So rather than end on complete pessimism, I forced myself to think about, okay, what could we do that would possibly work over the long run? And I do think there is a constructive role for the international community to play in building states, and especially in helping groups within war-torn societies overcome some of their social and political differences. State building will always be a largely internal process, something that we've forgotten over the last several decades. Right? It took 4 or 5 centuries, depending on how you want to count, for capable, effective states to develop in Europe. It's a very long-term process. There's no particular reason to think that we can jumpstart this same process into 6 months in a clean intervention. Think about it this way: there's no state in a box that you can buy at IKEA, bring it home, assemble it with multiple languages, some more or less well translated. Right? You can't do it that way. Right? This is going to be a long-term process in all of these societies. And it's going to have to be done mostly by the people who live in those countries. There's no doubt about that. So there's no reason to expect quick results. But the best thing I think we can do is try and create an international environment that encourages compromises within fragile states. And by making the benefits of international cooperation contingent on at least the creation of minimal states at home, we can have an effect over time. Not in the short run, but over time. What I have in mind here is, in fact, the benefits offered by the United States to Western Europe after 1945. Participation in American security umbrella, participation in an open, liberal, and vibrant international economy that sort of hung out the carrot in front of Japanese societies at the time, said if you can overcome your history of fascism, if you can build constructive and effective democratic states, we will allow you to participate in this international order on favorable terms. And that provides an inducement for those societies to overcome their differences and adopt states that are not only capable, but are compatible with international order. The same has happened in Eastern Europe as a result of the prospect of membership in the European Union. To join the European Union, you had to adopt a code of laws that reflected those of the majority in Western Europe. You had to have a stable state, effective rule of law, and market economies before you could even be invited to apply for membership, and certainly before you became a member. This has also worked very effectively to induce the East Europeans to settle some of their potential differences that they might have had with one another and to unify around states that can provide a rule of law and a stable social order for their citizens. So it is here, I think, that the international community can make a potential difference. Key, though, is being willing to make those benefits contingent. If you offer the carrot and the reforms are not made, you have to be willing to take it away as well. And that has sometimes been difficult for us in the past. But this is where I think we can make a difference and where I hope we'll direct our efforts in the future. And with that, let me stop, and I will welcome questions after a short break, I gather.